Hey there. I'd like to do more lighthearted content at some point. I considered myself a gamer, even if I kinda suck at most games. I'd like to find some slightly less grisly political topics to discuss in a more whimsical manner. It would be nice if I could have the opportunity to make more jokes, perhaps do some deep dives into representation in video games, or talk about inclusivity in the comic books or the movies or something. I came into this with big plans to ultimately make videos about my dogs and tabletop RPGs and cooking and cigars and my taste in bourbon. Have you tried Jim Beam Devil's Cut, by the way? It's excellent. But of course, in the decade that has passed, in the 3 months that have passed since I started this channel, some less than pleasant societal issues have taken priority. Alas, this is the timeline we occupy, and I cannot bring myself to talk about mundane things in my scripted videos while there is so much work to be done. So, at time of writing, it has been a little more than 3 months since the video of the death of George Floyd ignited an international uprising and amplified calls to address police brutality and systemic racism. Did you know that in that time, there have been 262 fatal police shootings in this country? Seriously, in a 3-month period, while under protest and heavy scrutiny, American cops just cannot help but execute members of the population at an alarming rate. Come on, guys. This is a capitalist country. We're supposed to die of a mishandled pandemic or of preventable illness because we can't afford health care, or in a corporate carbon emission-fueled environmental catastrophe, or, by our own hand in a society that doesn't prioritize mental health. The good news is that there is a conversation going on. There's a conversation going on about solutions. And while I am all for abolition of the police and I openly advocate for it, the sad reality is that our elected officials on both sides of the aisle don't seem too keen on unseating that power structure just yet. So it seems like defunding and reform will be an unavoidable first step in the journey to a post-police world. As is expected with conversations like these, I've seen a number of suggestions, albeit well-meaning, but not very well thought out. So grab your shopping cart and your mask, and we'll maintain 6 feet social distance whilst we enter the marketplace of ideas and discuss the police problem, and while we're shopping, discard the ideas that won't work. As I said earlier, a lot of these suggestions come from very well-meaning people, allies in the movement who are just as desperate to see systemic change. So I don't think that some of the bad suggestions come from malice so much as a lack of knowledge. I should also state that what I am putting forward here are my opinions. I feel informed in my opinions due to my background and previous interactions, but I could very well be wrong. This is going to be a long process, and mistakes will be made along the way. But getting out of our current system of policing in America has to take top priority, so we can't be afraid to take bold steps. A bit of my background. I'm a security professional. At one point, I was even actively pursuing a career in law enforcement or corrections. Yes, I know, I have a very dark past. Maybe I'll make a video about it, who knows. Anyway, at one point, I'd made it pretty far into the selection process for a county law enforcement agency before I encountered some, we'll say, systemic barriers to entry that kinda ended that process and disillusioned me to the entire industry as a whole. Even then, I've worked a number of physical security jobs at varying levels, including being a bouncer at nightclubs to executive protection, senatorial details, and VIP escorts, as well as bodyguard work, and I've done this for over a decade. In the state where I lived, you had to attend a class to become certified to work as an armed security officer. I attended this class, which was taught by a retired federal law enforcement officer and a former trainer for the cops. I watched all of the same videos that the police in the academy watch. I've been taught by police lieutenants on filing reports and use of force and gathering evidence and conducting investigations. While I was in the process of selection for a law enforcement position, I even took it upon myself during my own time to dig up additional training materials utilized by the local police with regards to things like use of force and apprehension of suspects. To this day, I work very closely with law enforcement for my job, and being rather nosy, I usually take the opportunity to casually pick the brains of the cops who come to my place of employment whenever I can. All of this is to say that while I've never found work in law enforcement, I have a solid working knowledge of the basics of how police agencies operate, and I interact with cops on an almost daily basis. While there are people out there who prefer their boot leather with a bottle of A1 sauce, who will then use this to immediately dismiss any opinions I have on the subject, I feel that I can offer some insight and nuanced takes on the given topic. So this takes me to my first point. A lot of the conversation on police reform is centered around training. This takes many forms. Some people will comment on the short number of hours that are required in some jurisdictions for the police to gain certification as peace officers. Others will suggest mandatory mental health and de-escalation training. I feel that that's all well and good, but training isn't the problem. Seriously, training isn't where we need to focus our energy right now. Obviously, extremely problematic elements like warrior training should be removed, and I think that most industries across the board could use training in racial bias at the hiring level. But here's the thing to remember. Cops are already trained. No, really, hear me out. Eric Garner was killed because a cop used a restraint technique that was already banned from their department. 2 different cops have been killed in Texas when they performed no-knock raids on the wrong person or wrong house and also didn't announce that they were police. It is part of their training and has even been established at the federal level before that once contact has been made with a suspect, they must announce their presence. How else will you know that the good guys are coming to kick down your door and shoot down your dog as opposed to some 2-bit home invader? Recently, a man named Jacob Blake was shot 7 times in the back by Kenosha, Washington police after breaking up an altercation and attempting to walk away from police officers and get into his van. A van that held his children, by the way. Thing is, cops are already totally taught how to apprehend an escaping subject. Physical restraint techniques and verbal instructions have been part of just about every police academy curriculum for decades. If you have 3 officers and 1 suspect that's non-compliant, you absolutely do not need bullets or tasers or chokeholds to immobilize them. Trust me, I've worked in enough rowdy nightclubs and I've restrained countless people, even while they brandished knives or broken beer bottles or chair legs. And I didn't even get to use handcuffs. Usually all I had was a flashlight. The only reason that they would be so comfortable, so easy and ready to escalate the situation to deadly force is because they know that their actions will be justified and they won't be held accountable. But I am tipping my hand a bit. Trust me, we will get to that later. We've seen police draw firearms on a vehicle with children in it over a stolen doll. The video shows a terrified family sitting in their car as cops point loaded weapons at them. This is another failure to adhere to training. There exists a concept in the tactical world known as time, distance, opportunity. Time, distance, and opportunity. This is the philosophy that police are taught to utilize when going into a potentially dangerous situation. So, looking at time, when you arrive on the scene, you take time to assess the situation and gather as many details as you can before making your next move. This ensures that the right steps are taken. Distance. If the situation is rapidly evolving, or you don't have all of the details, you maintain a safe distance until you've had the time to assess the situation and the environment. Opportunity. Now that you've taken the time, at a safe distance, to assess the situation, you find the right opportunity to act and take your next step. This can be discovering that the threat potential is minimal and you can safely approach, or this could be as extreme as responding to an active shooting in progress and finding the right moment to effect lethal force. Now, I don't think this is too difficult a concept to grasp. I explained it in a few seconds. But it didn't stop the police from drawing weapons on a car with children in it, or gunning down an armed, law-abiding black man helping people to escape from an active shooting in a shopping mall. And once again, none of the officers involved were held accountable. There are also pretty clear-cut guidelines on when to utilize lethal force. Every agency varies, but they all use some form of a technique called the use of force continuum. This is very similar to the rules of engagement and escalation of force training that soldiers are required to have, but sadly, even a blood-stained entity like the United States Armed Forces tend to have more accountability for forgetting their training and not strictly adhering to these guidelines. The use of force continuum has many different forms, but they all follow a similar hierarchy and essentially lay out a chain of increasing levels of threat or non-compliance and the recommended response. You start at the bottom with physical communication, flashing lights, hand signals, or just the physical presence of the officer. It then moves up to verbal communication. This can be shouting or spoken words, followed by non-lethal tactics such as mace, disabling baton strikes, taser, or physical restraint. Then, and only then if this fails and the suspect presents a credible threat of severe bodily harm or death to themselves or others, then you utilize lethal means. This can be firearms, baton strikes to vital areas like the head or spine, and potentially lethal restraint techniques. And I didn't make up any of that. You can find plenty of documentation and examples of this concept. This is an established part of the use of force training for virtually every cop across the country. But the point of the training is clear. There needs to be a credible threat, and even then, lethal force should be the last resort in any given situation. Body cam footage showing the attempted arrest of George Floyd showed multiple cops struggling to control a handcuffed subject and resorting to kneeling on his neck. They act as if they haven't received significant training for this very situation, despite the fact that you spend multiple days in the police academy being taught how to physically handle a non-compliant subject. But this training is often thrown out the window the moment they start engaging with black subjects. After all, this is America we're talking about. We aren't known for responding appropriately to threats. And there you find that same lack of accountability. And that's the biggest problem with the suggestion that police reforms should center on better training. They already have the training. Heck, they already have the funding. But they operate with the knowledge that there will be no repercussions for deviating from their training. Even if it winds up with someone's life being ended for the whole world to see, cops in America get to operate with impunity. Due to things like qualified immunity, powerful police unions, and our overall warped sense of crime and punishment, cops are able to go about their daily duties, knowing that they can wield the power of life and death over the very people who pay them to protect and serve. The best training in the world won't matter if there isn't accountability for failure to adhere to the policies and procedures. Before we can talk about training, we need to ensure that the police will be held accountable and brought to justice for deviating from procedure. Abolition of police is ultimately my goal on the horizon. I am definitely advocating for abolition. But in the interim, we need citizen review boards that the police need to answer to for their actions. Education. This is connected to the training element, but I've seen a lot of memes going around comparing police education requirements to that of registered nurses and lawyers, usually followed up by the proposal that the job of police officer require a 4-year undergraduate degree. On paper, this doesn't sound like a terrible idea, and in and of itself, it isn't. However, this ignores a few things. Every single cop I've ever met has a college degree. Every single one. and I've closely interacted with several police in half a dozen major cities across 4 states. While most agencies don't explicitly list a 4-year degree in their job requirements, it's almost become an unwritten rule for applicants that you need not apply unless you've finished college. I've even spoken to some cops in wealthy neighborhoods that have stated that it is such a high priority that they will take college graduates over veterans and active duty military. I know that my failure to complete college was certainly questioned multiple times during the interview process, along with my credit score, my unpaid debts, jobs I've been terminated from more than a decade prior. And you know what? It's almost like there are some classist elements to police work. Yeah. And that's kind of my second point. We live in a country with a criminally high cost of tuition for higher education. By requiring a college degree for a job that holds so much power over the lives of so many Americans, we are essentially locking police work behind an invisible and unspoken class barrier. Do you really think this will make the police force more empathetic to the needs of the working class? Or the neglected and impoverished communities of color that they over-police? Yeah, good intentions, but a bad idea, because we're skipping a few steps to get to that point. Although I feel like there was some old dude that had some really crazy ideas that could have helped make this a reality. Anyway, increased funding. God, what a terrible idea. Who would even suggest something that stupid and pointless? And okay, moving on. More black, female, trans, minority cops. This isn't really a solution, is it? While more inclusivity and representation of marginalized communities in the police forces would perhaps maybe provide some newer, fresher perspectives on some of the issues facing these communities, it would fail to address the institutional and systemic problems in the field. There are no shortage of incidents of police brutality where cops of color were complicit in the injustices being committed. There are also no shortage of incidents where the victims were white. A black man was the police chief of the Minneapolis Police Department that murdered George Floyd. While vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris was the prosecutor, black people continued to be disproportionately persecuted by law enforcement and the prison industrial complex in her own state. This is the same as asking for more female drone pilots. It's liberal performative pandering masquerading as systemic change while ignoring the actual problems. The takeaway from this is that there are some very real and effective steps we can take on our path to police abolition to make for a more just and free society. Defunding the police and redistributing their massive bloated budgets to other more effective means of community outreach. Taking police out of the equation when it comes to responding to calls that aren't threats to public safety. And making communities made up of the communities they police that have the power to hold them accountable are all good places to start. I look forward to hearing more ideas in the coming days, but I hope we at least now know, when discussing potential solutions to the problem of police brutality, what will and won't work. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please click like and subscribe. And let me know in the comments any other bad suggestions for police reform that you've heard. Follow me on Twitch, where I stream games and give lectures. Follow me on Twitter, where we can discuss the finer points of bourbon and beard care. And if you're so inclined, I do have a Patreon. Thanks again.